The night he blocked me, I was eating a bowl of cold grits at 2 a.m. and thinking about how beautiful our life looked from the outside. And that's exactly why I almost didn't survive what came next. My name is Celestine Aura Beaumont Wilds. Most people who know me call me Celly. The ones who love me call me Starbright. And the man I married, Devereaux Osei Mensah, used to call me his compass. Said I kept him pointed towards something worth reaching for. Said he never knew what direction he was facing before me. I believed him. I built a whole architecture of faith out of those words, stacked them like stones along the riverbed of our marriage, walked on them every single day. Then one Thursday in late November, I sent him a voice note. 37 seconds of me saying I missed him, asking what he wanted for dinner, telling him the landlord had left a notice about the parking space. And it sat in that little delivered purgatory for 4 hours before I noticed the circle where his profile picture used to be had gone gray. He hadn't just stopped answering. He had erased me. Not from his life in a conversation, not in a face-to-face, not even in a cowardly text message with punctuation that tries too hard. He had gone through every platform: Instagram, WhatsApp, iMessage, Snapchat, even the LinkedIn I didn't know he still had, and systematically removed every digital thread that connected us. The precision of it scared me more than the act itself. You don't do something that methodically in a moment of anger. You plan it. You sit with it. You maybe even practice the order. And I had been eating grits and watching a documentary about migratory birds. Let me tell you about Devereaux first, because you won't understand anything I'm about to say if you think this is a simple story about a man who ran. Devereaux Osei Mensah was the kind of man who ironed his jeans, not for occasions, just because. He had a particular relationship with order. Everything in his apartment when I first visited him had a precise place, a reason for being where it was. His bookshelf organized not by author or genre, but by the emotional weight he assigned each book. He told me once that he put the heaviest ones on the bottom shelf because carrying those stories close to the ground felt more honest. I thought that was the most extraordinary thing any person had ever said to me. We met at a ceramics class in Decatur, Georgia that neither of us had signed up for intentionally. He was there because his therapist told him to do something with his hands. I was there because my best friend Odalis had paid for 6 sessions as a birthday gift and then broken her wrist rock climbing and couldn't come herself. We sat next to each other because the instructor paired us alphabetically, Beaumont and Mensah. And within 20 minutes, I had asked him 3 questions about his grandmother, and he had told me something he said he'd never told anyone before. That was the thing with Devereaux. He peeled back fast. He trusted without hesitation, offered intimacy like it was a natural resource he had in endless supply. I fell in love with that before I fell in love with him. I fell in love with the version of myself that his openness seemed to call out of me. We dated for 2 years and 3 months before he proposed. He did it at 6:47 on a Wednesday morning in the kitchen while I was making coffee. No ring, just his hands cupping my face and his voice saying, "I know this is crooked and early and I don't have a speech, but I don't want to spend a single morning of my life without you making that specific face when the coffee finishes brewing." I said yes before he finished the sentence. My mother cried when I told her. His mother cried when he told her. We both cried at the courthouse where we signed the license. We were married for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days when he blocked me on every platform without a word. The first 48 hours after I noticed, I did what I think most people do. I convinced myself there was a technical explanation. His phone was broken. He'd been hacked. There was some misunderstanding about a filter or a setting he'd accidentally toggled. I cycled through these theories with the focused intensity of someone who desperately needs the world to still make sense. I called his cell from my sister Marquise's phone. It rang 4 times and went to a voicemail message that was his voice, warm and familiar, asking callers to leave a brief note. I hung up without leaving a message. I called again an hour later. Same thing. On the 3rd call, it went straight to voicemail without ringing. He had seen my sister's number, maybe recognized the area code, maybe remembered I had a sister with a 770 prefix, and declined the call. I sat on the bathroom floor for I don't know how long. The tile was cold through my leggings. I could hear the refrigerator humming through the wall. I remember thinking with a very strange and detached clarity that I hadn't told him I loved him the last time we'd spoken. Our last conversation had been practical, logistical. We had talked about a bill and whose turn it was to drop off the dry cleaning. I had ended it with, "Okay, bye," the way you end a conversation about nothing, because I had not known it would be the last one. I thought about that "okay, bye" for months afterward, the casualness of it, how certain I had been that there would be another conversation and another after that, stretching out into a future I had no reason to doubt. My friend Odalis Price Fuentes came over on day 4. She brought plantains and a fury so quiet and controlled that it frightened me slightly. Odalis has always expressed love as vigilance. She notices everything, forgets nothing, keeps receipts not out of malice, but out of an almost maternal protectiveness she extends to the 3 or 4 people she has decided at some point to love permanently. She said, "Before you do anything, I need you to understand what you're dealing with." I said, "I don't know what I'm dealing with, that's the problem." She said, "Yes, you do. You just don't want to name it yet." She was right. I knew, in the part of me that sits below the place where hope lives, that this wasn't a mistake. That Devereaux had not accidentally blocked me on 6 platforms simultaneously. That the man who organized his bookshelf by emotional weight had made a very intentional decision and executed it with the same methodical care he brought to everything else. What I didn't know, what would take me 4 full months to understand, was why. Here is what I found out, not all at once, but in pieces, like a mosaic assembled in the dark. His mother, Ajwa, reached out to me on day 12. She sent a letter, an actual physical letter, handwritten on cream paper with a slightly formal salience to her sentences that told me she had thought carefully about every word. She told me that Devereaux was alive and physically safe, which I had not realized until that moment was the fear living at the bottom of all my other fears. She told me that he had asked her not to contact me, but that she felt as his mother and as a woman that she could not in good conscience honor that request without at least offering me that one piece of information. She did not tell me where he was. She did not tell me what had happened. She did not tell me if he was coming back. But she told me that what he had said to her, the reason he had given her for leaving the way he left, was this: "Loving Celestine was the biggest mistake of my life." I read that sentence standing at my kitchen counter, and I felt something inside me that I can only describe as a structural failure. Not a break, not an explosion, more like a slow collapse, the way a building that has been quietly compromised for months finally gives way not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of quiet surrenders, floor by floor. I put the letter down. I stood very still. I thought, I need to understand what he meant by that. Not because I was going to fix it, not because I believed I could call him back to me, but because I needed to understand it the way you need to understand the specific mechanics of something that has changed your body permanently. Not to reverse it, but to know what you're actually living with now. The 4 months that followed were the most disorienting of my life, and also, in ways I couldn't predict, the most illuminating. I threw myself into things the way grief demands. I worked extra shifts at the restorative justice nonprofit where I'd spent the last 4 years as a community liaison. I started running again, not for health, not for discipline, but because running was the only activity that consumed enough of my physical and cognitive resources to briefly silence the loop. I ran through Westview in the early morning when the streets still had that particular hush to them, past the murals on Lee Street, past the community garden where an older man named Absalom grew 3 varieties of heritage tomatoes and always offered to let me take some. I talked to a therapist named Dr. Yetunde Olawale Cross, a woman in her late 50s with a still, precise manner of listening that made me feel heard in a way that was almost uncomfortable. She did not tell me what to feel. She asked questions that cracked things open. When you say you need to understand, who is that understanding for? And what would it mean for you if you never got an explanation? And the one that undid me completely. Do you believe that loving him was a mistake? I sat with that last one for 6 weeks. Here is what I eventually learned, through Adjoa and through Odalis, who is the kind of friend who finds things out not through dramatic confrontation, but through the slow, patient accumulation of information from people who don't realize they're giving it. Devereaux had been struggling for a long time with something he didn't have language for, a particular kind of terror that lives in proximity to good things, a conviction, not reasoned but bone deep, that anything worth having will eventually be taken. His father, Kofi, had left when Devereaux was 11, not violently, not dramatically, but with the quiet finality of a man who had decided that the particular life he was living was one he no longer wanted. No warning, no conversation, just gone. Devereaux had talked about this in therapy, had processed it with his former therapist, had told me about it early in our relationship with what I took at the time to be transparency, and what I now understand was something more complex, both a genuine attempt at openness and, underneath it, a test. A test to see if I would stay anyway. I had stayed. And in staying, I had done something that, without intending to, had slowly become unbearable for him. I had made the prospect of losing me feel real. This is the part that breaks your heart differently than you expect it to. He had not left because he stopped loving me. He had left because he loved me enough that the possibility of losing me, of having me one day decide, as his father had decided, that this particular life was not one I wanted to keep, had grown into something he couldn't live inside of anymore. He had looked at our life, the mornings, the dry cleaning conversations, the cold grits at 2 a.m., and the whole warm, ordinary infrastructure of us, and he had felt, with a sudden and overwhelming clarity, that he was not built to survive the loss of it. So he had done the only thing that felt like control. He had left first. I want to be careful here because I know how this can sound. It is not romantic. It is not a love so profound that it broke him. It is not something you admire or mistake for devotion. What Devereaux did was a wound he had been carrying since he was 11 years old, one that had never fully closed, one that had calcified around a core belief, that love is a countdown, that closeness is a slow-motion loss, and that wound had, without his fully meaning it to, detonated in the middle of our marriage, in the middle of my life, without my consent. Understanding that didn't make it smaller, it just made it something I could actually see. He called me on a Monday in early March, 4 months and 3 days after the blocking. I was in the parking lot of a gas station in East Point, having just stopped to buy a bottle of water after a long run, and my phone screen lit up with his name, his actual name, not a contact I'd kept or a number I'd saved, but a name I'd deleted and that my phone, in some algorithmic memory I hadn't anticipated, still associated with an incoming call. I sat in my car for 2 full rings. Then I answered. His voice was the same. That was the first thing I registered, the complete familiarity of it, the specific timbre that I had fallen asleep beside for 3 years. He said my name and I heard everything in it. The apology he didn't know how to begin, the question he wasn't sure he had the right to ask, the grief that had apparently also been living in him, in its own shape, for these same 4 months. He said, "I know I don't deserve to be talking to you right now." I said, "You're right." He said, "I've been in intensive therapy since December. I want to explain if you'll let me, not to ask for anything, just to explain." I held the phone and looked out the windshield at the gas station, the ordinary human traffic of a Monday morning, people filling their tanks and going about their lives with no idea that I was sitting inside a moment that would define something important about who I was going to become. I said, "You can explain, but I need you to understand something first." He said, "Okay." I said, "What you did wasn't just about you. I spent 4 months not knowing if you were alive. I spent 4 months trying to understand what I did wrong, what I missed, what I should have seen. I spent 4 months grieving someone who was, as it turns out, just in Savannah at your cousin's house, functioning, eating food, watching television, while I sat on bathroom tile and tried to figure out how to keep breathing. So you can explain, but I need you to hold that while you're doing it." There was a long pause. He said, "I know." He said, "I'm sorry." He said it like he meant it in a way that cost him something, the way real apologies do. Not clean, not resolved, but raw and insufficient and genuine all at once. We talked for 2 hours that Monday in the gas station parking lot. I moved my car to a side street after the first 20 minutes because a man kept looking at me like he wanted my spot. Devereaux told me everything. About the terror that had built in him quietly over years. About the moment he had stood in our kitchen 3 days before he blocked me and watched me laughing at something on my phone. Genuinely laughing, wholly myself, entirely alive. And felt a love so total and so frightening that it had tilted into something that felt like falling. about how he had not told his therapist how bad it had gotten because he was afraid that saying it out loud would make it true, about how the night he blocked me, he had convinced himself, in the specific logic of a wounded mind, that doing it first was protecting me from the version of loss he had always assumed was coming. I listened to all of it. I let it land. When he was done, I said, "I believe you, and I also can't come back to something without knowing it's different." He said, "I know. I don't expect you to." I said, "I need time." He said, "I'll wait." Here's the thing about waiting that nobody tells you. It requires you to also be doing something. You can't just suspend yourself in the space of another person's process and call it waiting. I had spent 4 months in the worst kind of waiting. The waiting that doesn't know what it's for, that has no object, no end, no horizon. What Devereaux was offering now was a different kind. A waiting with parameters, with intention, with the understanding on both sides of what the waiting was supposed to be making room for. I spent the next 8 weeks being extremely deliberate about my own interior. I talked to Dr. Olawale Cross about what I actually wanted, not what I thought I should want, not what would make the best story, not what my mother hoped for or what Odalis suspected. What I, Celestine Aura Beaumont Wilds, wanted when I was honest enough to hold the question without flinching. What I found when I went looking surprised me. I still loved him. Not as a reflex, not from habit, not because my identity had become so entangled with the marriage that leaving felt like self-amputation. I loved him because even in the worst 4 months of my life, the things I had mourned were not just the comfort and the company, but the specific person. The bookshelf organized by weight, the jeans ironed for no occasion, the voice note I had sent about grits, and the parking notice that had never been answered. I missed him with the precision that tells you something is real, but loving him and returning to him were not automatically the same decision. We started meeting in person in April. Therapy together with his therapist, a quiet man named Dr. Phineas Okonkwo Levi, who had the rare gift of creating enough safety in a room that both people in it could say the true thing without needing to armor it first. It was not comfortable. It was not a reunion. It was a series of difficult, necessary conversations about the ways two people can love each other and still do real damage, about what safety means and what it requires, about the difference between forgiveness and return, and how one can exist without the other, and how both can coexist without being rushed. Devereaux was different in those sessions, not unrecognizable. The same man, the same voice, the same specific quality of attention he'd always had, but with something that had been missing before, a willingness to stay in the discomfort of accountability rather than moving past it too quickly. He did not explain himself into innocence. He sat with what he had done and let it be what it was. That mattered more than I expected it to. Today is July. We are not back together in the way we were, and maybe we never will be in exactly that way. Something shifted in those 4 months that I don't think fully shifts back. But we are in something. A deliberate, clear-eyed, eyes-open something that we are both choosing, every day, without the innocent certainty we had the first time. He called me his compass again last week. I told him I wasn't interested in being anyone's compass, that I was my own primary direction, and he was someone walking alongside me, not someone I was orienting for. He laughed. Then he said, "That's better anyway." I think about that okay bye less now, not because I've resolved it, but because I've stopped needing it to mean something it can't mean. I've stopped needing the last ordinary conversation to have been extraordinary. We say casual goodbyes because we believe there will be more conversations. That belief is not weakness. It is love operating normally, in the absence of catastrophe, which is what love is supposed to do. What I know now is this. The biggest mistakes in our lives are rarely the ones we intend. They are the ones we make from the oldest and most protected wounds. The ones that have so thoroughly convinced us of their logic that we act on them without ever stopping to ask if the story is true. Devereaux was wrong. Loving me was not the biggest mistake of his life. Believing the wound was right about what would happen was the mistake. Loving me was just love, imperfect, frightened, extraordinary, real. And I am still, despite everything, entirely glad he did. If this story made you feel something, hit that like button and subscribe. More truth coming every week, for everyone who's still standing in the middle of their own 4 months.